Hello and welcome to the Give Grow and Be Grateful podcast. I am really excited today to talk to you about one of my favorite concepts, and it's really the foundation of a lot of the different elements that I'm going to be discussing and sharing with you throughout this book. And for those of you that are here for the first time or just checking back in, I'm basically speaking my book. I'm just kind of sharing the different topics and I'm diving in. I've got the outline and breaking everything up. And so I'm just going through that with you. Love to get your feedback and thoughts as I share different concepts and ideas and some of the things that have worked for me personally. And then also through that process, I've started to switch it up. So I'm going to be talking about other topics as well. I'm going to have some guests on from time to time, just to kind of switch things up because I enjoy it. I really enjoy talking with other people and kind of diving in and getting a little deeper. And so we'll be going through a number of different topics. Everything from really understanding people, right? Like why we are the way we are, understanding human psychology and just the human experience in general, I think is huge. I come from a very long history of a marketing background and own a digital marketing agency. And so I love to talk about psychology and marketing in general, love to talk about business and entrepreneurship. I also love to share topics on financial literacy. And so I'll have some different guests on to talk about that as well, just to provide some information because I think it's so critical. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're getting in the beginning steps of starting a nonprofit to basically teach a lot of this kind of self-awareness, what we maybe call emotional intelligence, and just learning how to manage oneself more effectively. But also bringing in financial literacy and making sure that education is not only engaging, but it's accessible for our teens across the board to make sure that it's accessible to everyone. And so I'm really excited to be doing that and playing a small part in what I think is one of the most critical things that we can do, which if you are ever like me and you like to jump in and randomly try to solve the world's problems, because sometimes I'll just try to think from a business and technology standpoint and some of the different ways we problem solve and come up with solutions and innovate and leverage technology to solve bigger social dilemmas and problems and things like that, which is what I do sometimes because I guess that's just something I like to do. It's a strange quirk I have. And what I've always come back to, no matter what the challenge is and the different thing, it comes to raising our collective consciousness and self-awareness as individuals across the board. And if we can do that, there's a lot of other things that we just solve just by being the best version of ourselves. We solve so many other problems. Now, that's a big feat, but I'm going to do my part, share what I've learned that works well for me. Hopefully, along the way, a couple other people do their part, and we'll just continue building that ripple effect, which you'll hear about later. So, with that, I'm going to touch on the riverbed concept, what it is, why it is basically why it is who we are, right? The riverbed concept is it's an in-depth concept that will basically provide an analogy for you to better understand why you are the way you are. It'll also hopefully help you learn to figure out if that's the way you want to continue being, and if not, how you can change that, change some of those patterns and habits in order to be more of the way you want to be. And that's a number of different things, from healthier um, to happier to more compassionate to more patient to whatever it may be that is something that you want to work on for yourself, more giving. There's a lot of different things that each individual feels is important for them and that they want to get better at. And so the the basis of the riverbed concept is that, and I'll break down some of the different elements, but the simplest version of it is that our everyday thoughts, our emotions, our actions are like the water of a river, right? They flow over the riverbed, right? And they follow that path of least resistance, right? Flowing through the riverbed. Now, the riverbed is made up of our core beliefs, layers upon layers that have been stacked through the ages, through all these different experiences of our history, where we've created these associations and beliefs over time that have come to develop our own identity of who we are, our worldview, the way we see things, the way we see other people. Core beliefs are things like, I am good, right? I am smart. There's things like that, right? That are core beliefs where you've made judgments about yourself. There's also core beliefs where you've made judgments about others, about the way the world works, right? Um, and then there's your biology is a huge part that comes into play. I'll dive into that and what a critical component that is, as well as our state and how that can influence different things as well. Now, each almost most of the elements that I cover today are actually I'm going to go into, they're going to have their own episode later. I'm going to dive a lot deeper into that topic. So if I just cover something at a very surface level today and you're like, that I didn't really get it, I'm going to, or you want more, I'm going to cover that in more depth in the future. So I want you to think, there's a couple different things here, and I'll show you this riverbed. This is actually, I took a hike up the gorge between Oregon and Washington. That's the river that separates the two states. I hiked up there and I took this picture among many other pictures. But at the time, I don't know if I actually um, knew I would be using it for this, but it works nonetheless. And so you can kind of see here how there's this pattern, right? The water has kind of came through the land, and it's kind of created these patterns, right? So through repetition, lots and lots and lots of repetition, water can be very forceful, right? Water can be very strong over long periods of time and can create pathways. And a lot of times it'll follow the path of least resistance. But we'll talk about later when we get into thinking about changing those habits, how it can actually be utilized to create new patterns, right? And to create new grooves along the way. So there's a couple different ways that we'll look at this. One is, in some ways, these patterns we create are like, if you think of all the different tributaries, right? So if you were to zoom out from this and keep going back and back and back and see all these different tiny little tributaries that where the water is kind of flowing in, right? So the water's flowing in and ultimately building up this bigger river in this case, right? In this case, it's the Columbia Gorge. So, but you have all these little tributaries, and all those little tributaries are basically patterns, right? And so we're made up of just billions of different patterns from that's in our biology, basically in our brain, creating new neural pathways. And that's when we talk about the biology, we'll talk a lot about the neural pathways and how those become reinforced and stronger over time. How you can basically neural pathways change. We'll talk about neuroplasticity and how the brain can create new patterns, right? And all this flows into understanding of the riverbed concept and how those patterns are created, right? So one of the big things that is important, again, probably have a whole entire episode on this, is the pain pleasure principle, right? From when you were very young, you started learning what to associate pain with and what to associate pleasure with, not just physical pain, but mental or emotional pain. Some of that was through your own experience. Some of that was through modeling from parents. Some of that was modeling through friends and those kind of peer associations and peer groups and things like that. Um, some of that you had literally no control over, right? In fact, a large majority of that, if one of the most beautiful things about humans, like I think when you look at us in general, like we're pretty magical, like we're these. So when you start to understand how we work at a deeper level and all that kind of stuff, it's like we're pretty amazing biological creatures, right? So but we also when we come out of the oven, so to speak, we're not fully cooked, right? Like a lot of other animals come out and they have what they need to survive, right? So they come out and they're already sometimes standing and walking, right? You have a horse that comes out and can get up and start moving around, right? As a human, you come out now you're only half baked, right? So now you're ready to be informed by the environment, which actually is one of the reasons we are so adaptable, right? So we are very adaptable, and we start to learn through kind of pain and pleasure, a lot of that, right? We have hunger pains, we have other things where we start to learn and start to experience all these different things, and we learn that this means this, right? And this means this. And we just start stacking, right? We start stacking all those beliefs on top of each other. Everything from understanding a sound to pulling that sound together in a word, to the meaning of that word, to the meaning of multiple words together, to eventually understanding really in-depth concepts. And that builds that riverbed, right? And so not one person is the same. We all have different experiences because you were born to a specific set of parents, and maybe you were born in another part of the country with very different culture. You might have been born in a specific belief system, right? It may be a specific religion. You might have been born during a certain history and time. There's all these different elements that come into play, right? So your environment does play a large factor. Your biology plays a good factor as well, right? Like where you came out from that standpoint. But you have a huge opportunity once you get to the point where you start have your own agency and ability to control things. You can start to make your own choices. What ends up happening though is most people follow that pre-built, that kind of inbuilt belief system and riverbed and everything that they believe about themselves and about the world and all these things because it's comfortable. Even if there is pain there, it is pain that they know, right? And it's comfortable. So over time, that that riverbed has been built, and sometimes those large, like if you look at here, that large ridge, right? Sometimes that makes us hard to understand other people's perception, right? We can't see the other side of that because we have our own belief structures that kind of block us from seeing other people's perceptions. And it's really important, I think, especially today, to get better. So there's a couple things about this that we'll dive really deep in is self-awareness. I think emotional intelligence as a whole, we'll do a whole entire series on that. Emotional intelligence as a whole is a deep dive into understanding yourself, becoming more self-aware, right? And what's crazy is there's a lot of things where you think, I know myself, I'm with myself every day. But until you actually start doing the exploration and start learning more about yourself, you'll actually come to realize, wow, I didn't know myself quite as well as I thought I did, or at least I wasn't I wasn't getting to know myself as well as I thought I did. So, and that could totally sound hokey to a lot of people. Get that 100%. But it's like one of those things where once you experience it, it's one of those things that's hard to understand until you experienced it. If someone's ever been like myself, where I'm eating, and I'm like, I start to want to lose some weight, or I want to get in better shape and take care of myself better, and I start eating better. And you get to that point where you notice, like, oh my God, like this is what it feels like to feel good. I haven't realized this whole time that I've been experiencing life in this area, right? Like I've been in pain for a while because I've been eating horrible. And I just thought that's the way my body was. That's the way I thought it felt. That same thing is true with the way we're using our mind, the way we're using our body, the way we're managing our state, our energy, our emotion, all those different things. And once you start to gain a deeper self-awareness, right, then from there, you can actually start to become better at managing yourself. When you're better at managing yourself, you can often get much better outcomes. You can experience life in a much better way. And from there, what ends up happening is you tend to be able to be more effective at helping others and influencing others as well, right? So once you have your own agency and you start to feel like that, you can help actually influence others from that standpoint as well. So there's a whole entire aspect that we'll dive deeper on a lot of those concepts. Um, Beliefs, biology, state. So I want to talk about a couple different things. Beliefs are one of the most powerful, to me at least, beliefs are one of the most powerful forces in the world. If you think about it, beliefs I mean, like our beliefs about ourselves, about the world, about all these things, what's right and wrong, and all that stuff, it, on one side, will cause a person to risk their life to save another person, and on the other side, will cause a person to take their life to kill thousands. Right. So if you think about the power of belief, it's immensely powerful, and that's literally what's shaping our life every day. I'll touch on this a little bit, but when we're in autopilot mode, which is basically when we're operating from a subconscious level, which is about 95% of the day for most people. There's a Harvard study on consumer behavior and things like that, literally looking at the brain and where things are firing and how people make decisions and operate and things like that, make purchase decisions, right? From a marketing role, I need to understand people often better than they understand themselves so that I can communicate things effectively in a way that will resonate with them. Now, some people use this knowledge to manipulate you in ways that aren't necessarily aligned with you. So there's a big difference between manipulation and influencing, right? And really, it comes down to best interest and alignment as far as what you say you're going to do and what you actually deliver, right? So we work with companies that tend to, whoever their customers are, whoever they choose to serve, that they are serving them at that, that they're working to serve them at the highest level. Not that they're perfect, where none of us are perfect, but that they're working to serve them at the highest level, and that is their intent, and they look to do that, and what they say they're going to do, they work on doing that, right? But then you have commercials like Samsung, who understands our deepest fears, and then they'll play on them by basically saying that if you don't buy their TV, you're not going to have any friends. Your friends are going to look down on you, right? So, um, and that's literally a subconscious driver that's built into humans, is the fear of not being accepted, being in a group, and it comes back to survival. So when you start to move into beliefs towards biology, we have different parts of the brain. We'll dive into everything from understanding the rational brain, the the more limbic brain, the more emotional brain, the reptilian brain. We'll talk more about like the reticular activating system, how that influences what we actually see in the world. So there's literally like 40 million bits of information that our subconscious brain can process. But you have a small percentage of that, like about 40 bits, that your conscious brain can process. And so your reticular activating system is that spotlight that takes your attention and focuses it on the things that are your subconscious brain deems are important. And unfortunately, a lot of times that's worrying about what is going to hurt us, worrying about survival, which sometimes we don't have a lot of you know uh, lions lurking around the corner these days. And so our brain has started to look at everything else from social. Being embarrassed socially, social media, all these different aspects. And so our brain actually looks at that and can have that same kind of fight or flight response and get into like what's called an amygdala hijack, affect your whole entire nervous system, which literally lowers your immune system. It hurts your health. Like once you start to get into all these things and understand how these are all connected, because your belief, right, your beliefs, your biology, and your state, they all influence each other. They're all interacted and connected, with your state being your kind of mindset, your intention, your emotion, your energy. Like when you come from a place of fear, like it's very clear you're operating, your brain is literally at a different wavelength, but you're also operating at a different frequency. Your energy is very different. People can tell when you're operating from that standpoint. It's like there's like a signal built in that we can kind of see that you're coming from a standpoint of fear or lack of abundance, scarcity, where you feel like you either need them or you need something from them, and people get that sense, right? On the other side, if you're operating from a position of love, from abundance, just unconditional giving and love, like that can also be felt as well, right? And so there's very different in how that actually influences your biology. We'll dive really deep into that, which is something that is really cool. Like once you start to learn how to more on demand, and more intentionally be the way you want to be, on an ongoing basis by managing your state and your energy so that you can show up better for people. And whether you're in a leadership position, whether you're in a position where you're just want to be a great team member, whether you want to be a great husband, whether you want to be, great at a sport, all those different things come into play when you start to gain more awareness and better self-management from that standpoint. So one of the things we'll talk about with the riverbed concept is why changing patterns is hard. So a lot of people focus and love them. I know where they're coming from, and my one of my tendencies for the longest time was action solves everything, and to some extent I agree with that. But I also spent a huge portion of my life doing that and getting to a point where yes, I was very successful by most people's measure, but I was also not experiencing life in the way I wanted to experience life, right? And so there's a difference between taking lots of action and heading in a direction and then realizing the direction where you're at isn't necessarily where you wanted to be. So there's a balance between understanding and action so that there's alignment. So I would say if you're taking a bunch of action that's not in line with where you want to end up, that action's not valuable for you, right? And so it's really about learning how to align yourself. And when we talk about the riverbed concept, we'll talk about how the past comes into play, that basically a lot of times is determining your present and your future, how where you spend a lot of your time in the future or in the present or in the past, how that comes into play and how it's important to do those things, right? Because you want to travel to the future in your mind and think about what does my vision for the future look like? And how do I want to be? Like if I'm going to do these things and I want to be this way and I want to be healthy and I want to be, someone who is giving to others and right now, maybe I'm not there yet, right? And so I, what am I going to do to that? And how am I going to align that with my values and what things will feel purposeful for me, right? So we'll say purpose, vision, values, and purpose, but really it's what's purposeful, right? Not falling in the trap of what's my one true purpose, right? Like that kills a lot of people because it's like, I'm trying to find my one true purpose in life rather than realizing that there's so many things. And it's really about creating things in such a way that your everyday moment, you live in a way that feels purposeful for you, because those things align with your vision and your values, right? So you're heading in that direction. So once we start to look at the um, trajectory and look at kind of the path forward of that riverbed, and again, we can drill down to specific kind of tributaries and go, okay, this is a habit I want to change. And for some people, people think of habits as just actions, but there's emotional habits. There's places where you get into an emotion and you stay there, and it's not always necessarily good for you, right? There are thought habits where you get into these spirals, and how do you actually get out of those, right, and change those? And so, willpower is a necessity, but it has its limitations. So if you've ever tried to change a habit and you've like worked really hard and you just are willpowering it and you're pushing forward, it's basically like you're swimming upstream and you're swimming upstream. And that's good. And you're doing it, right? You're doing action. But eventually, no matter how hard you try, if you're swimming against the current will eventually take you. And now it's important to build that muscle up and you get stronger and stronger and can use willpower longer. And it's a critical component of it. But you have to understand if you don't change the underlying beliefs, you'll end up falling back in that pattern again because your beliefs are supporting those other thoughts, right? If you take all those things and you use your biology in a way that's more effective with your beliefs, manage your state in a more effective way with your beliefs, then you can basically say, hey, I'm going to take this old habit, this old way of being, and over time, right? And one is being like very much this is part of the love and know yourself part that I talk a lot about. It's realizing that you haven't probably been compassionate with yourself in a really long time. You haven't been taking care of yourself. And there's reasons why, because you developed at a young age, you started to think, well, I need to punish myself for these things. And like, if I get off track, I have to like beat myself up over it. And so there's a lot of different things you start to realize is like, it doesn't really benefit you. It doesn't work well that way. So if you're starting to go, you know what, I have this old channel right here, this kind of old pattern that's been developed, and you don't necessarily take that on as being yourself. It's just like, I've developed this pattern and I'm going to change the pattern over time because I created associations that made this pattern beneficial for me, and that's why I'm doing it. Even if the pattern itself isn't beneficial for me, there's an association in my mind somewhere that's saying I'm either avoiding pain or I'm getting pleasure by following this pattern, this pattern of attention and thought, emotion, action, things I'm doing. There's something that I'm telling myself that I've created an association with, and I'm saying that this is beneficial, right? Either avoiding pain, avoiding a greater pain for a lesser pain, or getting pleasure in some way or another, whether it's an addiction, whether it's smoking like cigarettes, or whether it's a pattern of thought. Whatever that is, you've created those associations. And so as you look towards like, I have to fill up that old channel, right? And I have to start creating a new channel. And so you don't necessarily take all the water and just flip it over real quick. You start to, and you can do that. So, but it depends on what you're doing, how big the change is, all that kind of stuff. But there's also ways to make it work more effectively by just starting to stream a little bit of water in this direction and then rewarding that, right? So you start putting some time, your thought, your emotion, your action in this new habit. If you fall back in this pattern, you don't kill yourself over it. You just go, you know what? And you keep reinforcing this new channel, right? This new part of the riverbed, this tributary. And you start kind of building that out, and you start understanding how pain and pleasure associate with that in the past, what pains come from that. If you keep doing that, like what is your current pain? And if you keep doing it, what does the future look like with this pattern down the road? How's that going to affect you? How's it going to affect the people you love and care about, and affect others, your future, children or your coworkers or whatever it may be, right? So you start to understand what that is, and then you look at this new one and you go, you know what? You start to associate pleasure with saying, you know what? With this new pattern, I am going to feel better about myself. I'm going to feel better in the future about myself. It's going to create a better future because I, won't be as reactive, or I won't be as, I used to have a challenge with road rage, and that took me a while to change. And so that was a big thing where it's like the thought that was happening in my mind when someone cut me off on the road was that they were trying to hurt myself or my family, right? And so when you have that thought, when you associate that meaning with it, your response is to, put them in their place. In some cases, it depends on the person. You might do something totally different. You might just get very angry and move off to the side. But I usually, what I did way back when was I would drive up and then cut them off so that they knew what they did and not to do that wasn't okay. I was like, I was teaching them, I was telling them. But what I was doing in that same instance was I was actually putting myself and my family in danger by what I was doing. And so one of the big powers, when I say belief, it's the understanding, what meaning are you assigning to this? Because meaning means emotion. Meaning means emotion. And so we'll talk about this in the future when we talk about going from autopilot to manual mode, being able to downshift out of your subconscious into more of a conscious state so that you can actually, that water flow slows down and you can start to become more conscious, and you can start to steer in the direction you want. And steer stands for stimulus, thought, which is meaning. What is the meaning you're assigned to that? Emotion, action, and result. And when you start to break that down, then I can change. I can go back through that instance and say, you know what? I realize they're probably not trying to hurt me and my family in any way. In fact, they might have something going on in their life and I have no idea. It's not about me. It's really like they may actually be going to the hospital because they have a family member there and they're freaking out. Like, I have no idea what's going on with them. And so, but instead, that's my thought. And then I go, you know what? I use a question because a question guides our attention. Use a question to redirect myself of how can I keep myself and my family safe in this situation. So when I ask myself that question, instead of assigning that meaning to it, and I ask myself that question, it leads me to the action of answering that and saying, well, probably just slow down a little bit and let them go on about their day. It has nothing to do with me. I don't need to tie up my ego in it or anything like that, which creates a result of myself and my family being safer, right? From that standpoint. So that's part of what we'll talk about, and we'll deep dive in that. I think that's a critical component. But one of the big things I want you to understand from all of this is the power of our attention. So, our attention, when I talk about our attention, it's our thoughts, our emotions, our actions, where we are putting our attention and the quantity and quality of that attention. So, if you think of water just kind of flowing, right? This water will flow down the thing. But if you start to take water and you focus it more, if you've ever seen a water jet, it can cut through steel. It can cut through like I've seen, I think 12-inch thick steel, like just focused water with usually with some sediment, but it'll literally cut through steel with that focused attention. So there's a combination of knowing how to use our willpower, knowing how to do it in the right way where you're focusing your attention in such a way that you're creating new patterns, you're creating new habits. You understand that your brain is literally how it's rewarded, and that it has neuroplasticity, so it's literally creating new patterns. It's taking your neurons and creating new connections, and it's strengthening those connections based on our associations in our brain of pain or pleasure, right? If we feel there's a reward from this, it will start to create those connections because the neurons that fire together wire together. You start to create these new neural pathways and you start to break old habits, right? So there's all those different elements once you start to figure that out all out. And just over time, we'll talk about the upward spiral where if you're just working on just getting a little bit better over time, you start to kind of be on this upward spiral where you're constantly just getting a little bit better. And rather than focusing on these huge things, you're thinking about just the little things, the ordinary things that you do consistently every day, and how by doing those things every single day, it ultimately will result in the bigger picture. So with that said, I know we went over a lot, but I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to the Riverbed concept, and I'll be diving in a lot more in the future. So thanks.